to talk about strategies to support families living with dementia. And in the next 40 minutes or so, I'm going to go super high level. Now, you've probably already worked with families. You have a good idea about what they need. And I'm just going to hit the highlight reel. Okay, this is not a deep dive. This is a 30,000 foot. Think about this when you're thinking about planning. Okay? All right, so first, what are we doing here? You know, the first thing that you're doing is identifying in the assessment key challenges and needs and problems that people are facing. We talked about that all morning, right? You're assessing the picture of someone, how someone's doing, right? Cognitively, otherwise, you're kind of getting a picture of how they're functioning. You're also providing emotional support. You're listening, you're validating, you're joining with people. You're part of their team to be able to fulfill their goals. Most people's goals include staying at home and being as independent as possible. Not everybody, but for most people, wouldn't you agree that that's what they want for most people? So you're listening to what they're saying, you're validating what they're saying, and you're joining with them to try to do things that will help them achieve the goals that they have, right? And you're connecting them to services and resources. You're assessing them, you're really listening, you're being there for them, and you're figuring out, if I put this in place and this in place and this in place, it's going to help you get farther down the road to achieving your goals, right? These are the strategies you're employing. That's in your toolbox. There are a plethora of services and supports for seniors and that can also work for people with cognitive impairment and memory loss. Everything from adult day to respite to Meals on Wheels to exercise to physical therapy to grief counseling to general counseling, home modifications, hospice, legal services. There's a lot of stuff out there that could be really useful in your toolbox, not only for seniors who have physical disabilities, but also to seniors who have cognitive disabilities, okay? Terry mentioned earlier, and we talked a little bit about the doctor, and this is what I'm getting at here. This specifically is about referring people for a workup. This is a Direct Connect program that was started, but I'll tell you, I worked for the Alzheimer's Association for a really long time, and I did a lot of working on the helpline. There's a 24/7 helpline, which you'll probably hear about later. And even though that wasn't my job, I would sit in at lunch and answer calls to keep my finger on the pulse of what was concerning people. And one thing, we collected a lot of information. We did an assessment, and I started to crunch numbers about it. And what I found when I did that was that people, from the time the doctor, even if the doctor told them to call the Alzheimer's Association, the gap between the time they got the phone number and even a recommendation to call us from their physician and the time they actually did was an average of 2 years, okay? So I want to tell you this, because it's not, if you recommend a service to someone who has Alzheimer's disease, first of all, that disease impairs somebody's memory and ability to follow through on plans, especially as the disease progresses, but even in the early stages, it impacts initiative. Also, very early on, people don't think they're having that much trouble, and so they may not need it yet, right? So they're not as proactive as they could be. So keep in mind when you're making referrals that warm connection, which means direct connection, making the call yourself, doing it while you're in the room, having a three-way call with a service provider so you get things hooked up right away, fax referral, that's something that's direct where the client isn't left to be the one who has to initiate the connection, is going to be 100,000 times more effective and faster than if you give them a phone number or if you do anything that isn't that, okay? So you can really speed up the process by doing something warm. And do you know what I mean by warm? Direct. Get the service provider on the phone, make the appointment yourself, figure out the transportation, go the extra mile, because they're not gonna be able, they're compromised, their brains are compromised. All right. Now, I'm going to talk about some general things that when you have somebody with Alzheimer's disease or a related dementia that you should be thinking in your mind that can really make a difference in helping them. These are the things I'm going to touch on. Number one, if you do nothing else, if you can do zero else, you must build a team of support for these folks. Whether that's paid or family or church people, it does not matter. You must help people to understand that if their goal is to live at home or to be independent or to live well, there is a 0% chance that they will achieve that goal without a team of support. 0. It is not possible. Alzheimer's disease is a team sport, not an individual sport, okay? And it is a marathon, not a sprint, all right? No way to be successful without a team. You must identify a support system for people. If we find people are cognitively impaired early on, they have often an existing support system in place. They're still doing social things, they may even still be working, they're still doing things, and you can shore that up, right? As the disease progresses, people withdraw, and the social support system becomes narrower and narrower and narrower until finally you've got one person who's alienated all their friends, they don't have any support anymore. It's a lot harder as the person gets more and more severely impaired. Okay, so starting early, this is another reason to do it. Think outside the box. If they don't have a primary caregiver, maybe you're thinking by task. Okay, you know, they got to have their medication. They failed the mini-cog, so what does that mean about their ability to manage their medications independently? Can't do it, right? So who's going to help with that? Maybe it's the neighbor. Maybe it's somebody from church. Who's going to help them with transportation? You know, eventually, I will tell you this, everybody in this room is going to have to retire from driving unless you get hit by a bus or something, okay? We all will have to retire from driving. So if you have Alzheimer's disease, that might happen sooner. It will happen sooner. How are you going to think about these people not losing their independence when they retire from driving? So putting things in place, people who can take them to church and continue to stay active. Disease education is also really important. People don't get a lot of information about the disease when they get a diagnosis generally, and even if they do, they often do not remember it. It's sort of like when you say you have cancer, and then whatever is said after that might as well be a wah, wah, wah. It's like Charlie Brown's teacher, right? Whew, you're focused on what they just told you and everything else goes out the window. So asking people what they know about their diagnosis can help you to fill in the gaps about what they should know and what they need to know. It's important, I think, to know what people's fears and concerns are because you can start there. You can start there. The other tip I would give you is be stage specific. If someone's early stage, don't start with hospice. They're not ready for that. Start with where their biggest concerns are and solving immediate problems and one little step ahead. You know, one thing that they could do to avoid a problem later. And then see them again and start with the next thing and then the next thing. It's breadcrumbs, little steps, planting seeds. People can't absorb much more than 1 to 2 pieces or topics of information who have compromised brains. If people want to stay at home and win the game, you got to think about safety, okay? So when you think about safety, I think about the 6 F's. Now, I made this up, the 6 F's, so do not Google it because you will get something that is not appropriate. Let's just say that. But you must think about these things when you're planning for people who have Alzheimer's disease or related dementia. So I'll go through them real high level. First, really you're thinking about where people get in trouble. People get in trouble when they go to the hospital, for sure. People with dementia do not do well in the hospital, okay? They do not come out of the hospital more cognitively intact. They do not. And no one knows this, and no one tells anybody this. So anything you can do to avoid a hospitalization that's unplanned would be save somebody a world of hurt and trouble. What are the things that put people in the hospital? One of them staring right at you. Falls, yeah. So thinking through fall risk assessment anybody with a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease is at risk for falling, or Lewy body dementia especially, okay? So think about that. Freedom has to do with wandering, and as someone moves into, this can happen anytime, but especially as someone's sort of moving out of early stage, they're at risk for wandering. The Alzheimer's Association will talk about the Medical Alert Safe Return program, but having a plan for somebody disappearing in a crowded mall is a good idea, because it'll happen, it could happen, and it's terrifying. Or somebody taking the car and disappearing and you don't know where they are. These things happen, and I tell you, from working with families that this has happened to, there's nothing more scary than having this happen. So planning for it is important. Freeways, we talked about driving. This resource from the Alzheimer's Association Driving Center, best thing I've ever seen, ever, for driving. It's actual videos with conversations between caregivers and people with early dementia about driving retirement. And it's done in just the most loving and wonderful way. Talking about how, you know, we're facing this as a team, let's figure out how to make sure you don't lose anything, make sure you can get where you want to go. It's lovely. I will say, though, that if you're somebody who tears up at commercials or anything sensitive, that you might want to close the office door before watching this, because it's really, really emotionally touching. It's lovely. Firearms. This is another danger area that is often overlooked. Obviously, gun safety is a big issue when someone has cognitive impairment, when someone has Alzheimer's disease. So if people do have guns in the house, figuring out a plan for hunting retirement may also be something in your game plan. People who have compromised brains also are at greater risk for financial abuse. And this is a very expensive disease. So for people to plan ahead with finances and set up systems, fail-safe systems that allow them to pay their bills and allow them to avoid having financial catastrophes happen is a good idea. And then finally, fire. Terry talked about earlier that even in the very early stages of the disease, when I talk to people who have mild dementia, they'll tell me, I'll be cooking, so I'm doing one thing, and I'm good with that. And then the phone rings, and I go answer the phone, and it's as if this never existed. It's like I'm in a tunnel, and as long as I'm in this part, it's fine. When I turn over here, it's like this doesn't exist anymore for me. So this is how we burn down the house. And I will tell you that it's very hard to live at home independently when your house is burned down. So thinking about a fire plan, and I'll tell another quick story about this. My dad had cognitive impairment. He didn't have Alzheimer's disease, but he had cognitive impairment. And he was asked by the social worker at our home what his plan was for if there was a fire. And let's just say the answer was not a good one. It did not make any sense. And I was like, I knew we had a problem, but I was surprised at how bad the answer was. But I wasn't too surprised because I knew he was cognitively impaired. And then the social worker came and did an inner assessment with my mom and asked her the same question. Now my mom, totally cognitively intact, okay? Her answer was also not a good one. So just keep this in mind. She was gonna carry him out of the house, okay? Not gonna happen. Not gonna happen. So I was just like, really? Oh, okay. So you'd be surprised what people's plans are, and you can really help them to make a better plan. Okay. Another thing that gets people in trouble and in the hospital and ejected from their home is behavioral symptoms. And Terry talked a lot about how behavior is communication. 50 to 90% of people with dementia will develop behavioral symptoms. Early on, anxiety, frustration, sometimes anger, which is not surprising. If you always could do something and then were struggling to be able to do it, I don't know, you might be frustrated and angry about that. It's pretty normal, and have anxiety. As the disease progresses, people can often have symptoms that are more physical or physical aggression, and a lot of people are also depressed, which can be treated. caregivers and professional caregivers and family caregivers can heavily influence the prevalence of behavioral symptoms. You can easily exacerbate a problem if you're not doing the best job with communicating. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Terry mentioned some of the symptoms or behavioral symptoms that people have. And so let's think just a minute about causes. For the person with the disease, the cause obviously ultimately is they have a brain disease that is impacting their ability to interpret the world, okay, and communicate. So that's number one. There's brain changes that are impacting their behavior. Always when I see a new behavior or I hear about it, I think first, is there a medical problem? Is this person in pain? Does this person have a UTI? What's going on medically with the person? So you can help with that. Medication side effects, all of these things can exacerbate behavior. Sleep changes, sensory or functional changes, emotional issues, or unmet needs. A lot of behavioral symptoms are the person's trying to communicate something they need, right? So some wandering looks like wandering, but they're really trying to find the bathroom, right? So getting to the bottom of that. Other causes of behavioral symptoms, the caregiver, right? Poor communication strategies, arguing with someone, being really impatient, pushing them to go faster, having high expectations. Brain diseases are invisible. So caregivers often expect that the person will behave the same way they used to. And that's a bit like asking a marathon runner to continue to run marathons when they have 2 broken legs. Okay, but you can see 2 broken legs. You can't see dementia on the outside. So helping caregivers understand they gotta go slower, allow more time, be patient, kind, and supportive, don't argue, all these things can help. The environment is another big factor. Things are too noisy and chaotic, or things are understimulating, or the task is too hard, or there's too many steps. Those are things that can influence things. I'll say this, especially once someone enters the middle stage, that person is not able to learn new things. So are they going to be able to change their behavior? No. Who has to change? The caregiver or the environment? The person can't change. Even as a caregiver, for my dad, I would take a step back when something got really tough behaviorally, and I'd take a deep breath, and I'd say, it's me who has to change. Yeah, it's me who has to change. Happy moments. And I like to talk about happy moments. I don't like all this, but I'll come back. Strive for happy moments. If whatever the caregiver's doing is not creating a happy moment, it's not good. Ditch it. Try something else. Because in life, that's what we got. We got moments. And with Alzheimer's disease, that's what you got. You got moments. If it's not a happy moment, pivot. Try something else, okay? Arguing doesn't work. It doesn't matter if they're saying something that doesn't make any sense or isn't true. If they're saying, yeah, I was here this morning talking with grandma, she was on the couch. Obviously that did not happen, but does it matter? Does it matter? No, who cares, right? Ask about how grandma's doing. I mean, you haven't seen her in a while, right? You may be surprised what the person says. It can be fun, right? But if you say, you weren't talking to grandma, she died 3 years ago, what's gonna happen? It's not gonna be good. The person might cry and not realize or have the whole grief episode again. The person may tell you that you're wrong. It's not gonna be a happy moment. By the way, these positive communication strategies are also really helpful for marriage. Yeah, I found. Be excessively polite, apologize even when you're not wrong, even when you're not wrong. I'm sorry goes a long way to de-escalating a situation. Don't take it personally. and then take a deep breath. Now let's go back a minute. This book called Coping with Behavior Change in Dementia, a Family Caregiver's Guide, it says it's a family caregiver's guide. I think it's a little high level to me. It's like if the family caregiver has a master's degree, then great. I think it's a little high level. But for you, I call this the Red Bible. It goes through every behavior possible and then tells you what are possible causes, what are some things you can try, etc. Okay, so we talked a lot about things that, deficits that people have and things to keep in mind, but you also want to make sure that you're not only minimizing disability, right, but you're maximizing abilities. So really seeing what can people do well and trying to maximize that and promote health, wellness, and engagement. Terry talked earlier about exercise being really important. If people still can do that, if they want to do that, see if you can build it into a routine. How, especially early on, help people to understand the importance of that. Nutrition, stress reduction, meaning and purpose in life, keeping relationships strong, health management, and routine. This book called Living Well was written for people with early dementia. And it's all about what does the research say about keeping your brain as healthy as possible and minimizing your symptoms, and what can you do? So it's a workbook. It can be really helpful. There's something here. Routine is very important, and the earlier you can start it, the better, because when memory fails, routine can be that backup support, okay? So if you always have lunch at a certain time, if you always do this at a certain time, early on you start structuring the day that way. When people can't remember what to do, routine helps because it's procedural memory, which is preserved in Alzheimer's disease for longer. So I will say that really helps people. Okay, what else can you do for health, wellness, and engagement? Well, facilitating regular physician appointments and helping people keep them by providing transportation and reminders is helpful. And we talked about medication management. I'll tell you what, medication mismanagement, if somebody isn't taking their medications properly, where do they end up? In the hospital. And is that good for them? So this is totally avoidable. So many people go to the hospital for avoidable problems, and this is one of them. So helping people to get a plan in place for how this is going to happen over time is critical. Caregivers are vital. Now you're building a team, right? Because a team, let's talk about football. Now, I don't know very much about sports, but one thing that I do know is that if you only have a quarterback, you're probably not going to win the game, right? And if you only have a quarterback and a linebacker, that doesn't really increase your chances all that much. Does anybody know how many people actually are on the field at a time and on a team? There are some men here, you should know this. Come on. Football. 11? All right. 11 would be a good team for a person with Alzheimer's disease. That would be great. You could maybe win the game, which means staying home and supported in your community if you have 11. So supporting caregivers by increasing their net and making sure that they're taking care of themselves, because I tell you what, caregivers don't do a very good job of taking care of themselves. And how do I know that? I've been a caregiver, and I didn't do a very good job of taking care of myself when that was happening. So if you don't take care of yourself as a caregiver, what happens? You get sick, and maybe you go to the hospital, and maybe you die. And then what happens to the person you're taking care of? Yeah, it's not good. It's not good, right? So people have to take care of themselves, but it's really hard to work with them to do that. Okay, so few special challenges. Living alone. Now, more and more people are living alone as older people. In fact, it's about 15 to 33% of people with Alzheimer's disease or related dementia live alone. That's a lot of people, okay? And that's really, really concerning. Up to 50% of that group has no one checking on them at least once a week, and 30% of that group has no support at all, okay? So how likely is it that they'll be able to keep doing that without crisis? 0% likelihood over time. So these folks are, of course, at greater risk for abuse and neglect, for fraud, for poor self-care, for accidents, for medication mismanagement, for loneliness, for accidental death, all of these things. Now, not everybody who lives alone with Alzheimer's disease needs a guardian, but you should know that people can live alone safely in the early and middle stages of the disease with a lot of support. So back to the care team. Obviously, if someone lives alone, the first step is to find out if they're cognitively intact enough to be able to do that, and then identify your support network and create a plan. The plan is going to be the same, but with extra stuff that helps them to stay in place, right? And there's a lot of assistive technology that can help you too, that you can access, that can help you keep someone at home. And I listed some things, I won't go over them now for time, but there's all sorts of things that can safety with the stove and keep lighting and all kinds of things with the home safety assessment that you can put in place. All right, so Hawaii is becoming dementia capable, but other states are also working on this. It's not just you, although you are getting to be farther ahead than most states, which is really exciting. You guys are blazing a trail, which is great. But there are other states who are also doing cognitive assessment, developing plans, and really focusing on dementia. And so we talked to them. We talked to the people who were answering the phone and going out and doing care plans and asked them what they've learned from doing this work. And first we asked them, what are some of the challenges, the biggest challenges that you've faced since you started this? And one of the challenges they talked about was people who call, who actually have memory loss, and they call and they have a full conversation and develop a plan, and then the person calls 20 minutes later, and it's like that never happened. And that's a challenge. That's a challenge. Behavioral symptoms, big challenge. How to help the person and the caregiver kind of manage that, big challenge. Lack of resources is a big challenge, especially for younger people and people who have early symptoms. There's a little bit more resistance and less services for those. And of course, financial barriers. People who are kind of in the donut hole of support. They don't have enough money to pay privately, but they're not poor enough to qualify for everything, so that's a real challenge. And then, of course, refusing help, breaking through when somebody just gives you the hand, right? How do you help them? So we asked them, what are some pro tips? We said, we're coming to Hawaii, we're talking to this group, what are some things that you would say to them? And they said, one of the most important things is just to be present, just to listen, just to be empathetic, and not to make promises you can't keep. They also said it was really important to know the resources and gave some tips about, with Alzheimer's disease, there's common things that people face, there's patterns. And so they're like selecting the top things and creating very simple sheets and resources for people in packets so they don't have to fumble for that every time. Simplifying what you're giving people is critical because, like I said, their brains are compromised, so less is more. Less information at a time, more times, right? They talked about the importance of understanding when someone needed more help, more in-depth consultation, the importance of warm referral and follow-up. And then they also said that when they're talking to people on the phone who have cognitive impairment, having that person write down what is said while it's being said can help with the next phone call. And also asking someone else, if someone else can join the call, was really effective. And then they talked about the importance of asking what's working well. And I hadn't really thought of that, so I thought that was interesting, but taking the time to say, what's going right, instead of just focus on what's not going right. Another tip was don't be afraid to report. There's a lot of worry about reporting for vulnerable adults reporting, but also for driving. And I'll tell a quick story about that. Terry, I'm going to go back to his grandma. Terry's grandma, who had Alzheimer's disease, was really small town, very rural, northern Minnesota. Been driving since she was 10 years old. You know, they start them early up there on the tractor, okay? And she's 90, has Alzheimer's disease, also some pretty significant vision and hearing impairment. And we start to get calls from people in town, because everybody knows people, and so they're calling, like Terry's mom, and saying, Thea, her name, is, you know, whipping donuts in the middle of the street and like jumping up on the curb and like really scary, the driving's not good. And the whole family's like, oh my gosh, you know, what do we do about this? So they brought it up to her, and she pulls out the finger, and I don't mean the bad finger, I mean this finger, this one. The one that says, don't you talk to me about this, I'm not gonna have this conversation, or I'm not gonna talk to you anymore if we're gonna talk about this. So everybody, of course, nice Minnesotans, backs up like 5 paces, and nobody wants to have this conversation because no one wants a bad relationship with her at the end of her life, basically. And so the calls keep coming in. I mean, basically, it's kind of this situation. Now around town, you know, you just see her hands up in the air. She's like way crouched down. And then one time we go up north to the cabin where everybody gathered, and Thea is walking down the path, and 2 people, one on either side, she's arm in arm having support. And we get about from me to Terry, and I say, hey Thea, and she goes, who is that? And I thought, holy moly. You know, this person can't see from here to here. She's got a 2-person assist to walk, and she's driving. And she's cognitively impaired. And we're getting calls from the whole neighborhood telling us that this is a problem and no one will address it. So we reported her to the DMV. Terry did it anonymously. You can do this anonymously. And just said, here's what's going on. She really needs a road test. She needs to come in. And they sent her a letter that said, hi Thea, you're 90, you gotta have a road test to get your driver's license to be renewed. So a couple weeks later, we go out to lunch, and she's there, and everybody's kind of quiet. She pulls this thing out of her purse and says, can you believe they sent me this, and I can't believe I've been driving since I was 10 years old, and do and all this stuff. And everybody's like, and then she says, well, you know what? I'm not gonna give them the satisfaction. I'm not gonna drive anymore. That's it. I'm 90, I don't need to drive anymore. And we all looked at each other, and then we said, are you sure? You sure? Yeah. And she got to choose. She chose. She said, I'm done, that's it. So that can help. The doctor can help by talking to people, but driving is a really tough thing. Okay. Continuing education is critical, and helping people accept help is also really tough. So does anybody here ever have trouble getting someone to accept help? Yeah? How about yourself? Have you ever been offered help and you're like, no, really, I'm fine. Have you ever done that? Yeah, okay. So accepting help is hard, you know, for us, for all of us. But there are some tips and tricks that you've probably worked on that may help you. One is, it's always better if it comes from a friend rather than some strange social worker that just showed up at your house. So if you can enlist other people to suggest things, that can be helpful. Routine is really important. People are often scared of losing control, so giving choices as much as possible, but watching what choices you give. So don't say, you could live at home independently, or you could go to the nursing home. That's a choice that probably they're gonna pick independently at home, but you could maybe, you know, we could assisted living or home care, you know, if they're resisting home care, right? Take small steps. Really helps, a little bit at a time. Sometimes people will try a new service if it's a trial basis, or if someone else goes with them, or if they're a volunteer at the service, or if the service comes to them. And then of course you're always going to focus on the client's values and interests, because that's how you roll. Okay, last but not least, Here's what people said, words of wisdom. Screening is doable and adds value. Starting earlier makes planning easier because people can be involved. As hard as it is to face having a chronic condition like Alzheimer's disease or any other fill-in-the-blank condition, with Alzheimer's disease, it's what you don't know that hurts you. Really it is. It's keeping this in the closet that's keeping us with a system that's chaos-based care, basically. It takes a village to support someone with Alzheimer's disease or related dementia. It really does. It takes a community coming together and relationships. Changing people's minds about the mind or about early detection or about all of these things is slow. It's a slow thing, but doable and worthwhile. Plant seeds. And then it is possible to live better with dementia, with early detection, education, support team, and community resources. Now, I'm going to end with this. I have a dream that I'd like to share with you, and I hope you'll join with me. Currently, what happens to people is that nothing happens. There is no routine screening. And basically, when the bottom falls out, somebody gets the diagnosis, and then it's just one catastrophe after another until they die. That's basically mostly what happens to 60%, 70% of people with this condition. There are people that I've worked with, many of them, who once you initiate routine screening and actually do workups and give a diagnosis and then put plans in place, who actually do really well and maintain higher levels of functioning for longer and avoid catastrophic care. They're not in crisis all the time. They still have Alzheimer's disease, but they're living with less symptoms, with symptoms that are with symptoms that are less intrusive to their daily lives. So they're managing better the symptoms and potentially integrating strategies that help them to live better and have fewer symptoms for a longer period of time. So I've seen this, I've worked with countless people who have this happen to them. I have a dream that one day that's what happens to everybody. Because right now, this diagnose and adios situation that we have is terrible, and I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy. And you guys can help with this, okay? You really can. I have a dream that when it's my turn to have Alzheimer's disease, because I'm at risk just like you are, that somebody tells me this and that I am afforded the opportunity to do something different in the next year than I would have done and make plans that don't land me in the open bed. So I will end with that and invite our host to come up and talk to us about specific resources that can be in your toolbox for this island and this area.